Your Excellencies, Your Graces, Your Eminences, sisters and brothers and friends. First of all, I want to join those saluting the initiative of the WCC to create the space on behalf of the ecumenical family to address issues around the refugee crisis in Europe. I particularly want to firmly endorse the multi-stakeholder approach which has been chosen, thereby bringing together representatives from a wide array of structures, organizations, and stakeholders into this discussion. Connecting to what was said this morning, yes, indeed, we need to be careful enough so that words lead to effective action. Yet at the same time, I want to underline that in times of anxiety and concern about hate speech, demagogy, populist manipulation, which is all based on what people say and write, I believe it is right and timely to add our own words to the public discourse. Words of passion for justice and peace. Words with compassion for the suffering neighbor, because they are so much needed today. I want to begin my overview with two preliminary remarks which I believe are relevant for the topic today. First of all, indeed, this is not the first refugee crisis in Europe. The last one happened only 2 generations ago, right after the Second World War. Then 40 million people were on the move, fleeing, migrating, homeless, displaced, persecuted. Then it was largely Europeans. Stressing the point of the Assistant High Commissioner of UNHCR for Protection, Dr. Volker Türk, the international community at that time managed to cope with that huge challenge by pulling together globally. They created structures, the UN, the UNHCR in particular among them, and they created the instruments to respond to the challenge. The Refugee Convention in 1951 and the overall framework for international humanitarian law among them. The Lutheran World Federation was pulled together by the same tide resulting from both the trauma of violence and destruction and the call to serve the neighbor. After several failed attempts to bring together Lutheran churches before, it was that context of destruction and the call to service that eventually brought them together. Actually, the first resolution of its constituting assembly was about refugees and the call to work together for their sake. And this is what we in the LWF have been doing since then. Today, we work along 1.7 million refugees and with 750,000 IDPs globally, a number that grows annually by 10%. If the international community 2 generations ago, with much less resources and wealth available compared to what is available today, managed to contain the refugee crisis, how comes that today all of that seems to be so difficult, if not impossible? To me, it is not primarily a matter of resources and their availability, what challenges the response, but the principles that inform the allocation of those resources in today's world. Given this assessment, the refugee crisis, while it deals with people, with human beings, is at the same time a much deeper expression of a deeper crisis. Do we still understand ourselves as an interdependent human family? Does the value of solidarity have place in our world? Is the international community of states still committed and accountable to the structures and instruments it developed? Ultimately, we are dealing with the question of how we understand ourselves and our relationships as human beings in this one shared world. My second observation is linked to this first analysis. I personally will remember the year 2015 as the year in which, and let me offer this provocation here, the year in which Europe became somehow part of the larger world. The debt crisis and the refugee crisis, known for a vast number of countries and people around the globe, all of a sudden made themselves present in the European space. What was in the periphery, contained in the margins, all of a sudden showed up in the center, making traumatically clear that there isn't a single wall that will prevent these realities to move around the world. Neither the debt crisis, nor the situation of massive displacement because of impoverishment, nor the displacement of people living in midst of carnages as it is in Syria and other places today. Neither climate change, another dimension I haven't heard much about today, but which needs to be brought into this equation too. I join those preceding speakers stressing the need to go beyond the treatment of symptoms. A binding European law for asylum is not going to solve the European refugee crisis, as the title of our conference reads. It won't address the root causes, because they stem from issues around economic justice, climate justice, indeed also gender justice, as we heard earlier. As long as these asymmetries grow instead of decreasing, there is no doubt people will move because they want to live. Now, how to foster good practices to respond to these challenges? Let me offer 5 pointers. I believe that as faith-based organizations and faith-based communities, we need to continue mobilizing our spiritual resources. Hospitality and welcoming the stranger is common to most faith communities. The need to protect the vulnerable is part of our deepest faith conviction. Talking about LWF, we just need to make sure that churches understand, own, and bring into action their call to serve the neighbor. Here too, it can't be just words. They need to translate into action. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, we are pulled together as Lutheran churches in the context of great need and suffering. I'm grateful for the wisdom of forefathers and foremothers, for their spiritual insight that they had to come together in order to address prevailing challenges in Europe. In times of fragmentation as the ones we live in today, I want to make that strong linkage between our quest for unity, also in the ecumenical sense, and our service in our world. We cannot dissociate our quest for unity from the question of how we serve together in our world. Otherwise, unity is shallow. This leads me to the third pointer, the one of ecumenical cooperations. Since the very beginning, the LWF has been doing refugee work in close cooperation with churches and specialized agencies around the world. Nowadays, it is an active member of the ACT Alliance, which brings together a large array of actors, both churches and specialized agencies, working in the humanitarian field. It is critical that in these times in which we live today, we work closely together to continue building a global ecumenical alliance with strong involvement of local actors, including churches. There are huge potentials there, which I sense we can still tap into in better ways. Fourthly, there is a new recent development which I find most encouraging and I believe offers great potentials. It is the increasing awareness of, if not the close cooperation between FBOs, faith-based organizations, and UN agencies. Let me refer to two processes. first of all, the visionary leadership of former UNHCR High Commissioner Antonio Gutierrez, who called FBOs together to a High Commissioner's dialogue on faith and protection in the year 2012. There we discovered together and we fostered together faith as a resource to protect, and we issued jointly the call welcoming the stranger, an interfaith voice. Nowadays, we are moving further, exploring into the dimensions of faith as an asset in view of resilience of refugees around the world. Often we do say refugees are moving around without anything. That's not true. They come with a cultural mindset and paradigms. They come with their faith. Is that a resource that could be an asset when it comes to the resilience of human beings? The other process I want to refer to is the one unfolding right now. It goes around the issuing of the Sustainable Development Goals and the role that faith-based organizations have to or could be playing in this regard. Again, by helping to shape hearts and minds around these goals and by actually helping to implement. Archbishop Jacqueline early this morning mentioned faith literacy as a challenge in our world today. And I believe it is indeed a challenge, also among UN agencies and structures, to develop and dig deeper into that literacy. But we have to be self-critical as faith-based organizations too. We too have a lot to learn if we are serious about that cooperation. How to align our actions to international humanitarian law and to specific code of conducts which regulate the way we interact with refugees. How do we learn to speak to governments? And here it is very important to me to stress the point that insofar as churches we have a voice to raise when it comes to the moral imperative to serve and to support refugees, there is also a legal imperative. There are legal instruments. We shouldn't be preaching only to the government. We should be calling the government into account in view of conventions they have signed into. Both of us, therefore, have huge learning curves, and I want specifically also to mention how to construct theological bridges from our side to relate to issues and concerns around gender, as they were mentioned this morning. My fifth point relates to a very specific duty we do have as a faith-based organization, and which relates to something which His Excellency the Ambassador for Greece brought forward forcefully this morning, the interfaith or interreligious dimension. Again, we remain grateful to the UNHCR's initiative in 2012 that brought various religious actors together who are engaged with UNHCR in work with refugees. Out of that process, we became, as LWF, intentional to seek closer cooperation with a global Islamic humanitarian organization, Islamic Relief Worldwide. In 2014, we signed an agreement of cooperation which has led us to work closely together in Syria, among host communities of the refugee camp in Saadri, and in Nepal after the earthquake last year. Believe me, it makes a difference to people on the ground to see a Christian and an Islamic organization pulling together their resources and capacities for their sake. Believe me, it speaks to them as they read the conflicts and contexts in which they live so much along religious fault lines, when they see that in our joint action we seem to be countering that fragmentation. Archbishop Anche mentioned in her presentation there is religious fundamentalism, radicalism and extremism across religious denominations. In a time of fragmentation and isolation of identities, political interests are grabbing massively into religious communities to align power behind their interests. I believe we have a responsibility as FBOs to claim the religious space through words and action, to show what the president of the Lutheran World Federation calls a robust, steadfast moderation, thereby also helping to inform opinion in view of what religion is actually all about. That is indeed a huge theological challenge, because it doesn't only forces us to understand the other, it particularly forces us to look also into our own sacred texts and how they speak about violence against others, against women, and even children, and how we intend to read these texts given the world in which we live today. With this remark, I come to an end, coming to the beginning of my presentation. The words we read, the words we say, the words we fail to say, they all make a huge difference. The actions we do, the hands we stretch out, the welcome we extend, or we fail to, they all make a huge difference. We should do both. Use our words, constructing narratives, and use our hands, constructing concrete practices. I look forward to the directions the conference will give in this regard, to the words we want to say, and the actions we want to implement. Thank you very much.